Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we think again about the Bible on women and men, and we start with the correct understanding of what happened in the Garden of Eden back in the beginning. Today we'll be hearing from Bruce C.E. Fleming, founder of the True 316 Project. He's a former academic dean and professor of practical theology. The foundation of the True 316 Project is based on the research of Dr. Joy Fleming, who wrote the book on Genesis 2 and 3 titled Man and Woman in Biblical Unity, Theology from Genesis 2 and 3. Now enjoy today's episode of the Eden Podcast.
The focus of this episode is surprised by the word patterns in Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 to 17. Let's get started. In the days before GPS technology, a propeller-driven six-seater single-engine missionary plane took off from a grass airstrip heading out across the raw African rainforest. The destination? Another isolated grass strip more than 100 miles away. Some time after taking off into a clear blue sky, and before it could get there, the ground below was covered over by a thick layer of clouds that went on and on and on. Time passed. Where was the airstrip? An attempted landing any place other than that hand-prepared airstrip would result in a terrible crash. The pilot asked the passengers to pray, and then help look for a gap in the clouds so he could get oriented. Eventually, they would have to descend into those clouds to set down. Finally, one of them spotted a gap in the clouds. The pilot looked, recognized a landmark, and based on that insight, immediately banked the plane down into a rapid descent. As the plane descended below the cloud layer, the way to the airstrip was clear. I've been in planes like that, and I felt like the six in that little plane who found that gap in the clouds. The meaning of some verses in the Bible has been clouded as well. For me, the greatest insight through confusing clouds came when my wife, Dr. Joy Fleming, told me she had found the key to unlocking the reading in Hebrew of God's words to the woman in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:16. Using that key insight to navigate, she opens up the meaning of God's words to the woman given to her after God addresses the serpent tempter in 3:14 to 15. Many people think God cursed the woman in some way, and even perversely reordered relations between men and women in Genesis 3:16. Some people reject a God who would say things like they think was said in this verse. Others grit their teeth and hang on as they read through the words in their English translations, waiting till they get out of the clouded mess that seems to cover over the verses at the end of Genesis chapter 3. When that pilot took off from the grass airstrip, part of the success the pilot had in finding a landing place came in knowing the lay of the land. Also, the pilot knew the landmarks and could navigate by them. In her doctoral research, my wife discovered a clear pattern written into Genesis 2 and 3. These two chapters are put together using a 7-part pattern that's a chiasm. A chiasm can be pictured like a rainbow or as a bell curve. In a chiasm, the theme or words used in the first line or section, let's call it A, are repeated in the corresponding section at the end, A'. Likewise, with the second section from the beginning, B, and the next to the last section, B'. A chiastic pattern works this way until the center section is arrived at. That section is often the key or turning point to the chiasm. In Genesis chapter 2, God creates the man and puts him in the Garden of Eden. Then God continues to create and relate until the summit is reached in 2:25. In chapter 3, Satan attacks, and there's a sharp downward slope. The corresponding end sections of A and A' in Genesis 2 and 3 are that in A, God places the man in the Garden of Eden, and in A', God drives the man out of the garden. The discovery of the precise parts of the Genesis 2 through 3 passage provides the overview or the map of the terrain in Eden, so to speak. As my wife became convinced that these chapters were written in this pattern, she discovered the sub-patterns that tie ideas together in the Hebrew text. She noticed that God's words to the serpent tempter and the man both contained the same key Hebrew words following a parallel pattern, but that God's words addressed in between to the woman did not use that vocabulary or follow that pattern at all. She noted, however, that God's words to the woman did connect in a particular way to God's words to the other two characters addressed after and before her. This occurs in God's first 4 Hebrew words spoken to the woman in line 1 of Genesis 3:16. The 4 Hebrew words take several more words in English: multiplying, I will multiply, your sorrowful toil, and your conception. Then, one day, while reading a journal article by Dr. Isaac Kikuwada about a smaller word pattern way over in Genesis chapter 11, she had a gap in the clouds moment. As Kikuwada analyzed the structure of that passage, she inferred to a similar structure located in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis 2? Well, that drew her attention. That's my passage, she thought. If there was a recognizable special word pattern in Genesis chapter 2 in the first section of the upward curve of the passage, then we might expect to find a similar word pattern in the corresponding slope on the downhill side in Genesis chapter 3. She had been noticing for some time in her research a noticeable word pattern centered in the 4 words of line 1 of Genesis 3:16, linked to the words in this verse to the words in the verse after and the one before it. But she'd never come across anyone commenting on that, and even here, Kikuwada was only commenting on Genesis 2. People who earn a master's degree are supposed to gain a mastery of what's known about something. People who become a doctor with a research degree are supposed to go beyond the master's level. They're supposed to reveal something new or something to add to our knowledge in their field of study. Had she found something new here? More importantly, were there revelations from God in the text of the Bible that had been overlooked or that had somehow been clouded over in the past years? If we peer into the cloud of Genesis 3 looking for 2 landmark linking words, the linchpin construction becomes clear. In Genesis 11 and Genesis 2, key words in the center section of a linchpin construction are linked to the same or similar words below and above the center section. As pointed out by Kikuwada, in the Genesis 2 linchpin, in verse 8 in the middle, God brings together both plant life and humanity. Kikuwada shows that this important linking takes place not only in what the words say, but also in the way the words are arranged. The initial Hebrew word planted of verse 8 points down to verse 9 to the similar Hebrew word made grow. The last Hebrew word in verse 8, formed, points back to the Hebrew word formed in verse 7. When she read the remarks by Kikuwada on Genesis chapter 2, my wife banked her plane, so to speak, and dove down for a closer look at the details of what she had found to verify that the patterns in section A and section A' of Genesis 2 and 3 corresponded. Sure enough, like Genesis 2, 7-9, Genesis 3, 15-17 is put together with a middle section having 2 key words linking it to the verses around it. So, Genesis 3:16 is formed as a linchpin construction, with 2 key words linked to 3:17 and 3:15. As it turns out, recognizing this is very important when it comes to understanding these words and translating them into our modern languages. Missing the presence of this linchpin construction contributes to the mistranslation and misunderstanding of this very important verse. So, it's necessary to think again and to nail down what is going on here in Hebrew. As in the first linchpin in Genesis 2, there are 2 words in 3:16 that link to the verses around it. The Hebrew word sorrowful-toil in verse 16 links down to the same Hebrew word sorrowful-toil in the verse after it. The Hebrew word conception in verse 16 links back to the similar Hebrew word seed or offspring in the verse before it. This precise way of arranging these words did not happen by accident. It's one of the ways Hebrew is written out to deliver information in a memorable way. The first Hebrew linking word in 3:16 is itsebon. It means sorrowful toil, and points down to the same Hebrew word used in verse 17. There, God tells the man that the curse on the ground made because of him will result for him in itsebon, or sorrowful toil. In field work, each one, the woman and the man, would have itsebon, or sorrowful toil. And they weren't to be the only ones. All humanity, regardless of gender, is subject to this itsebon, this sorrowful toil. For we all have to deal in some way with the ground that God cursed because of the man. The Hebrew word itsebon is used only 3 times in the Old Testament. The third and last time is instructive. In Genesis 5:29, a new child is born. He is named Noah. Well, we've all heard of him. The name Noah means rest, relief, or comfort, which means relief from itsebon, relief from sorrowful toil. Here's what the verse says where it uses the Hebrew word itsebon. Now he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and the sorrowful toil of our hands, caused by the ground which the Lord has cursed." This sorrowful toil of our hands is true for the parents of Noah, as well as for the first 2 humans in the Garden of Eden. It's not something that only applies to the woman in Eden, and it's not something to do with the act of childbirth, as many modern versions would have us believe. It has to do with the sorrowful toil of our hands as we work the cursed ground. At the end of line 1 of 316, the second linking Hebrew word is used. It is heron, which means pregnancy or conception, and it points back to verse 15 to the Hebrew word zerah, which means seed or offspring. A literal translation of the 4 Hebrew words of line 1 of Genesis 3:16 in English would be as follows. 1. Multiplying. 2. I will multiply. 3. Your sorrowful toil. 4. And your conception. There's nothing in these words about the process of giving birth. These words are tied into the difficulty of field work, as in 3:17, and into the promise of the woman's conception of multiplied offspring who would vanquish Satan. But have you noticed in the English translation of the Bible you typically refer to that you can't make out the linking words in line 1? Almost all modern translations don't correctly translate the last 2 of these 4 words at all. They write out line 1 of 3:16 as if it's talking about pain in childbirth. They incorrectly treat the Hebrew words of the linchpin as if they can be merged into just one idea, and a new and different idea at that. They could do this if they had grammatical justification to do this. They could do it if in these words there were an indication of the presence of what's called a hendiadys. But there are no such grammatical indications, and the structure of the linchpin forbids doing so. Let's restate this. Modern English versions have been confusing readers by attempting to squeeze into one idea the important 2 different and contrasting linking words and ideas in line 1 of Genesis 3:16. They invent a single new idea that totally breaks the links that should be followed to the verses after and before it. This is equivalent to covering over God's inspired Hebrew with the repugnant word pollution of ideas God didn't put there. And the different ideas contained in this word pollution have flowed downstream, causing confusion and contradiction. This has created major damage in the translation and interpretation of a half-dozen key passages elsewhere in the Bible. Here is the wrong idea that gets plastered thickly over God's words in line 1 of 3:16. It's the wrong-headed idea that God in some way basically curses the woman at the very end of her 9-month-long pregnancy. Here are just 3 translations that word line 1 of 3:16 this way. HCSB, I will intensify your labor pains. NIV, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. NASB, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. Can they do this? They are doing this, but should they do this? Let me take you back to an interesting meeting we had when we were thinking about whether or not a hendiadys might be located in line 1 of 3:16. One crisp autumn, Joy's studies led us to New England. This area of the country is especially beautiful when the leaves change color. It's also the home of several renowned research schools and libraries. So she scheduled a visit with an Old Testament professor at a famous school and asked me to accompany her. As we went down the half flight of stairs to his office entry, a few copper-colored leaves swirled around our ankles in the autumn breeze. Inside, his office was crammed with books. We found space to sit and talk about the "and" in line 1 of Genesis 3:16. Professor, would you look at this Hebrew "and" tell us what you see? His comments, punctuated by long pauses as he reflected deeply, ran something like this. Here we have an example of a hendiadys. 2 things joined by "and" to mean a different thing. Yes, an example of a hendiadys. Of course, this one doesn't look like your ordinary hendiadys. The typical indicators are not present. In fact, there's nothing in the grammar to indicate that the words in this verse should be combined as if there were a hendiadys present. The words itsebon and heron could very well be read normally as 2 separate things with "and" in between joining them. But even though this doesn't look anything like a hendiadys, and it could be correct to say there is no hendiadys here, we know that it's a hendiadys. Thank you so very much, Professor, Joy said when the time came to a close. As we climbed up the stairs into the breeze and the leaves that greeted us, one thing was perfectly clear to us from our hour-long discussion on the word "and." There wasn't any reason to drop it out. There wasn't any reason to push the words together in line 1, even though the professor had said, "We know it's a hendiadys." Perhaps he was influenced by the writings of others who had passed along the incorrect assumption that this was a hendiadys, but the professor's observations made in front of us clearly showed that the widely held view wasn't necessarily correct. Without squeezing the words of line 1 into a hendiadys, the math in Genesis 3:16 line 1 is easy to calculate. One thing plus one more thing joined by the word and adds up to two different things: sorrowful toil and conception. Line 1 does not add up to one new thing: pain in childbearing. Joy likes to compare this to a math equation. To illustrate how the Hebrew grammar in line 1, she refers to the distributive property in mathematics. In math language, the distributive property goes this way: A times B plus C equals AB and AC. The left side of the equation is equivalent to the right side of the equation. The A term is simply distributed to each of the other two terms, B and C. The result is that both the left and right sides of the equation are equivalent. In the case of line 1 of Genesis 3:16, the left side of the equation is God will surely multiply. The right side of the equation has two elements. The resulting meaning is that God will surely multiply sorrowful toil, and also that God will surely multiply the woman's conception. As in the math equation, God is going to multiply not one, but two things. That's what a good translation should show us, but that's not what's out there in practically every translation. Joy's discovery uncovers a major error that modern translations are making in the way they are wording Genesis 3:16 for us into English. And the more we look at it, the more it becomes clear that this is a big problem. Have you ever wondered why God appears to be so harsh with the woman in 3:16? So have others. They've asked, if she was treated this way by God, then did she somehow deserve it? And if she deserved what was practically a curse imposed on her, only on her, just think of how bad she must have been. To treat her this way goes along the lines of the man's accusation that she had been his temptress. That was a false charge. The man had also blamed God. Both ideas were wildly incorrect. Neither the woman nor God tempted the man. Satan and the serpent tempted the man. Why would the man blame her, treating her as if she's his enemy? She's the enemy of the serpent. God has confirmed her as Satan's adversary. Would this powerful adversary have anything to do with working behind the scenes to twist the translation of God's actual words to the woman? It would be a masterstroke against her in public opinion. It would lead to serious mistreatment of women by those who thought her deserving of severe punishment. God treated the woman with respect. God warned her that she would have sorrowful toil in participating in field work, just as the man would, her fellow farmer, when they worked the fields God had cursed because of the man. God then built on his creation blessing to her. God promised that she would have multiplied pregnancy, and one of her offspring would be the Messiah. In his defiant challenge to God, the man dared to accuse God of being his tempter, and then the man had also blamed the woman as being his tempter. Neither charge was correct, and modern translations that promote the idea that God changed the last hours of her conception and pregnancy into a special moment of punishment are incorrect as well. We need to let Genesis 3:16 communicate its message to us clearly, without the word pollution. And we need to spread the true meaning of 3:16.
You've been listening to the Eden Podcast, and we invite you to visit our website at true316.com. That's TRU316.com for links to our books, blog posts, and our YouTube channel with more than a dozen in-depth workshops on the 7 key Bible passages on women and men from Eden on. You can also receive a study guide on this episode for use in small groups and more. Find that in our blog posts at our website or email bruce@true316.com to request the study guide. The Eden Podcast is brought to you by the True 316 Project, true316.com. You can help move forward the True 316 Project. Please visit patreon.com. And thanks for listening to the Eden Podcast.